documents themselves are also representations of what we want the world to look like rather than what it really is. Postmodernists would say, well, no, we can't actually get to an objective truth because these are materials written by fallible human beings. They're not the truth, they're a version of the truth. The document isn't necessarily an objective representation of truth. It's a version of what I as a person think is the truth.
Hey there, and thank you for tuning in. We're excited to bring you another great conversation today. If you like the show and want to support us, please hit the subscribe button so we can keep bringing you great content week after week. And if you're feeling extra generous, give this video a like and share your thoughts and comments down below. Thank you so much. And now, let's get into it. Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and in the studio today we're sitting with Tristan. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
You're an associate professor at the University of Nagoya, where you teach Japanese history, modern history, and you specialize a lot in urban development. So we have a lot of interesting things to talk about, especially how, for example, recent developments in the Meiji period, which is not too long ago, have impacted, cityscapes today and our lives as we know them here in Japan. Super excited to talk about this. But before we get into that, I'm curious a little bit about your background and what brought you to Japan, or perhaps how your interest in Japan got started to the point that you went on to study it scholarly.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and looking very much to talking with you. So the first time I came to Japan was in the year 2002. I was 19 years old. I was a study abroad student at Waseda University. And so then after that, I was coming back and forth until finally coming to Nagoya in 2022. And I've been in Nagoya since then. Looking back on it, I get this question a lot of how did I come to Japan? How did I come to studying Japanese history, especially Japanese urban and architectural history? It's one of those things, Japan was always there in my life, even if I didn't recognize it. So I grew up playing SimCity and playing with Legos. So that was where my interest in urban history and architectural history came from. But then looking back on it now, I was watching Japanese cartoons on TV. I didn't know they were Japanese. I was playing Japanese video games. I didn't know they were Japanese. We had exchange students in my house growing up. When I was growing up, they were Japanese. I didn't even realize that. And then I got to high school, and my high school was about 100 kids, and this was in Portland, Oregon. And the way to keep the doors open at this very small high school was to have about 25 exchange students each year. And so of those 25 students, they're from all over the world: Thailand, Germany, Korea, and there's always about a group of 5 from Japan. And so I was on the baseball team and the soccer team, the football team. Another one of the pleasures of being at a small school. I get to play any sport I wanted to. Our best baseball players were always the Japanese exchange students. So I became friends with them, and they started teaching me Japanese out on the baseball bench. And probably like many, maybe not the best words at first, but that really piqued my interest in Japan. And I was always interested in history. And so then when I went to university, the sophomore year, I decided to do a study abroad program. Ended up in Tokyo. And so that's where my interest in history, or my lifelong love of history, really came together with this newfound interest in Japan. So then when I went back to the United States, I finished a degree in history, went on to grad school, and focused entirely on Japanese history. And that's where I am now.
What was your experience coming to Japan for the first time? You mentioned growing up with a lot of Japanese culture around you through games, through anime, without realizing they were from Japan. Exchange students staying at your house as a young kid, also not knowing like they're from Japan, another country somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. What was it like when you first came?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, all the typical things about culture shock were true for me as well. I remember one of the toys that the exchange students gave me was a miniature bullet train and a miniature subway. So maybe that's where my interest in trains comes from as well. But I remember flying into Narita at that time because Haneda wasn't taking international flights, and looking out the window and being surprised that it really didn't look like what I thought Japan was supposed to look like. I expected all the houses to look like temples and much more traditional style. And so I remember Getting into the airport, of course, flights from the west coast of the U.S. always get in 4 or 5 at night or so, and so by the time I get to Tokyo, it's dark outside, and the Japanese students who met us at the airport took us to our hotel in Takanadobaba, and I just remember even Takanadobaba just seemed so otherworldly to me in terms of all the lights and the bustle, and let alone seeing Shinjuku the next night or Shibuya after that. I mean, I came into Japan not really expecting anything. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of anime or manga. I didn't really know much about Japanese culture other than what I'd read in history books. Uh, didn't even really look up any pictures of Tokyo or really any pictures of Japan before I came because I wanted to experience kind of fresh from the beginning. So again, just total culture shock, you could say. It was a good thing that right next to my hotel there was a KFC and, so and a Starbucks.
A little bit of kind of home comfort on your first few days.
That's right.
You already had an interest in urbanism and architecture at that time. So what was it like? Kind of, you said you were in a school in Portland, Oregon before that. So moving from the Pacific Northwest in the States to suddenly arriving in Tokyo. You mentioned Takanada. I never get this name right, but that's the station nearby where Waseda University is, if I'm not mistaken. And suddenly you're downtown Tokyo. What were your first impressions of the buildings, the structure, and everything around you?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, Portland, Oregon is a city of about 2.6 million. Other than that, I went to college in Corvallis, Oregon, which was a town of about 40,000 people. And so then all of a sudden, I find myself in the middle of, the Tokyo Yokohama megalopolis, which by some estimates, 40 million people. Right? So just the density of it, the fact that especially in a place like Takanadobaba, you very rarely see buildings that are fewer than 5 or 6 stories tall. But at the same time, you also don't see buildings that are taller than 10. Really, I mean, in Tokyo at that time, Sunshine 60 was the tallest building, um, and obviously, because of tectonic movements and earthquakes, you don't really get the tall buildings like you do, say, in like New York City. Right?
That was interesting for me when I first came to Japan, which was I think 2012 or 13.
Mhm.
Anyway, I was living in Shanghai.
Hmm.
And I came on a holiday at the end of my year abroad in Shanghai to Tokyo. And in Shanghai, all the buildings are so tall. The residential building that I was living in had like 49 floors, and that was the norm.
Yeah.
And then I arrived in Tokyo, and everything seemed like so small. But Tokyo is a bigger city, and it's also this kind of capital that emerged way before Shanghai did. So I was surprised. A lot of tall buildings, but not that tall.
Yeah, and another one big difference I'd say between, say, Shanghai or Hong Kong for that matter, these towns that have really iconic waterscapes where, viewed from the water, Shanghai has a very iconic cityscape. And there are places in Tokyo that I think are iconic, Tokyo Tower, the Skytree now, the Tocho building. But Tokyo doesn't have that same kind of iconic visage, right? The same kind of cityscape that is identifiable anywhere. And that really has to do with the history of urban development in Japan.
So was this already a time when you were starting to think about why is it like that and develop this interest in like actually studying this academically?
Yeah. So I was living in Shinagawa that year that I was on the study abroad program. So every year I would ride the train all the way from Oimachi or down in Shinagawa-ku up to Takanadobaba. And so, I mean, we're talking riding the Yamanote in the morning rush hour, and as I'm sure you're aware,
everyone's favorite thing to do.
Just incredibly crowded, and I'm a little taller than everybody else, so I'm looking up and trying to avoid eye contact with the people that are squished next to me. So often find myself eyes attracted to the railway network maps over the doors. And so the more and more I looked at it, studying this railway network map, I became more and more curious about why it developed the way it did. And so that's what I wrote my master's thesis about, was the history of the Tokyo Rail or the development of the Tokyo Rail network, and the historical reasons for why certain lines are going certain places, when it gets developed, all these kinds of questions.
What was one of your surprising findings at the time in that thesis already when you kind of started digging into the train maps of Tokyo?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest surprises for me was that, uh, we think of the Yamanote today as this ring line, and you think like, oh well, sure, that makes sense. You want to have a ring around the core areas of the city. Um, I mean, Berlin also has a similar line, and even with the subway development, the subways that have been constructed since then, this idea we're going to make a ring around the central core. Except in the case of the Yamanote, that's not at all how it built up. The reason the Yamanote is a circle is they built the western side first, and the reason that it forms a circle is at this time, you had two different rail termini. On the south, the Shimbashi station was the original government railway. And then from the north, you have Ueno's terminal, which was the Nippon Tetsudo, or the private, kind of a half private, half government company set up to build out the railway network with the support of government financing. So their terminus is at Ueno. And the reason they build it from Ueno to Mito is you're trying to get all of the coal out of the Mito, which is one of the major exports. From the west, you also have, say, going up into Gunma, into Nagano, you have the silk producing region, and so we have all of these commodities that are coming in from rural Japan, and we're trying to send them out to foreign countries so that Japan can make money to finance all of this modernization during the Meiji period. So they have to go from Ueno, literally put onto horse trolleys and carts down to Shimbashi so they can be put back onto a train to go all the way down to Yokohama and get put onto the ships to go overseas. And so one of the first leg of what becomes the Yamanote is built by the Nippon Tetsudo as a way to skirt the city. It goes all the way, and so it ends up connecting the around Akabane. It breaks off, connects down to Shimbashi, and it literally skirts the outside of the city so that it can avoid any sort of traffic and make this unbroken link between the productive regions in the northeast and the northwest down to the port of Yokohama. And so it's almost a complete accident that we get the Yamanote as a loop line. It was actually just built primarily for conveyance of goods and a way to have unimpeded traffic. And so Ikebukuro wasn't really there. I mean, the stations are there, but there's no Ikebukuro to speak of. Shinjuku is really a post town at this point. It's not really a big.
Hmm.
Shibuya isn't even, Gotanda. All of these stations that now we think of as kind of decentralized urban cores aren't really developed at all. And in fact, they develop because of the rail line is there, and then the development follows.
And so that's the power of adding a rail network to and bring public transportation to an area. It kind of leads to development. But I imagine that if you start studying this, and this is probably one of many things you've uncovered about how these maps kind of were made and why these stations are there.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to study this more. Did you continue your PhD into this kind of with the railway network and kind of diving deeper into this?
That's where it started. So I was really interested in how infrastructure drives development, and there's this question of which came first. And in the case of public infrastructure in Japan, it really was, if you build it, they will come. And so all of the suburban development in Tokyo after the 1923 Kanto earthquake, for example, is driven by private railway companies. I mean, we're in Osaka. Osaka is a perfect example of private railway
Yeah.
companies driving urban development. And the private companies in Tokyo, like Tokyu and Tobu and Seibu, are really following the model set up here in Osaka by.
So
Yeah.
these companies started doing this in Osaka first, and that
Yes.
was then copied in.
Yeah.
So in Osaka we have like Hanshin, we have
Yeah.
Hankyu, and Kintetsu as
Yeah.
well. They are the precursors
They are
for.
the precursors. I mean, Osaka, much more private railway focused, which is why you have Umeda and Namba, and JR comes in much later, which is why the Shinkansen even goes up to Shin Osaka, and not really central the way that Tokyo is built more around the JR network. And partly that's because the JR network gets started in Tokyo. The first line in Japan opens in 1872, opens between Shimbashi and Yokohama. This is the first government railway of Japan. It's called Government Railways of Japan. And then you get the Nippon Tetsudo Japan Railway Company, again with government backing, starts filling out this envisioned railway network. And so there's a couple of railway manias first in the 1880s and then the 1890s, where the government is basically handing out cash payments to former samurai and encouraging them to get into entrepreneurialism and starting businesses. There's a way to produce capital in Japan as well. But one of the things they encourage them to invest in is infrastructure. So railways, telegraphs, lighthouses, these types of things.
Why so many private companies and why so localized? So you mentioned for Tokyo, you have Seibu and Tobu. In Osaka, we have Hanshin, Hankyu, and more, which they are not in the respective regions. But if I think back about France, where I grew up, or Germany, where my family is from, we have one company that is just managing everything, which has also led to other kinds of issues. And there are discussions about privatizing and having more competition and so on. But here it's a lot.
Yes, it is now. Yes. So why private companies? Mainly because the government couldn't afford it all. The government had a railway network that they had envisioned that would spread around the entire country. And at this time, it's primarily concerned about conveyance of commodities for export. I mean, they're certainly concerned about movement of people, but I mean, the infrastructure at this time is really, and this is true for streets as well and other urban infrastructure. It's really concerned about increasing commerce. And so we want to connect productive regions to ports. The government can't afford it all, so rather than go increasingly into debt, they already took out a huge $20 million loan from the Oriental Bank in order to pay for the first government railway. But we don't want to keep going into debt, so we'll let private entrepreneurs start these railway companies with a number of stipulations. And this is where the first railway law comes in, and it sets a number of conditions. Everybody has to follow what's called the narrow gauge, which is 3 point. Well, I can't remember what the narrow gauge is off the top of my head, but it's the British gauge, a legacy of the fact that the first railway was constructed by British engineers who look at Japan, see a mountainous country, and realize if we're going to be digging tunnels, if we're going to be cutting away from mountains in order to put rail lines through mountains, if we can save a foot, then that means a lot less digging, which lower costs. So this is why Japan's railways are all narrow gauge, except for the Shinkansen, which is wider gauge. But the government can't afford it all, so you let private companies do it. With these stipulations of you have to follow this gauge, you have to follow lines that are approved already by the government. And so it's effectively handing over the construction of these lines. And really, it's actually the financing, because one of the stipulations and the agreements they made with the Nippon Tetsudo Gaisha, for example, the Japan Railway Company, is if you fund it, we'll actually use our rolling stock, our cars, we'll use our engineers to build it. And so it's effectively a way for the government to achieve the development of the entire railway network through private financing. And then in 1906, 1907, the government nationalizes all the railways. It ends up controlling about 90% of all lines.
So it's like after they've handed out all the tasks to private companies, like, okay, thank you for your hard work, we'll take over from here.
And then from the 1890s, there's a new railway law that's called the Light Railway Law. So many of these private companies like Kintetsu and Hanshin, these other ones you mentioned, are Tokyu, Seibu, and Tobu in Tokyo, are legally called light railways. And this is based on the 1892 Light Railway Law. And so that's when they're able to put in, not only street trolleys, but then these start buying their own right of way in order to develop the kind of suburban developments that they become known for.
So you originally started researching the train network in Tokyo, and that kind of expanded into, okay, why is there such a network here in Japan at all, and how was it built? Was this then the main topic of your PhD kind of dissertation?
It was one part of the PhD dissertation. My PhD dissertation was looking at railways architecture and urban planning. And so the more I studied railways, I realized that it's not just about the railways themselves. They're not just the network. I became much more interested in this reconstruction of Tokyo as an imperial capital throughout the 1880s and 1890s. As Japan becomes an expanding empire, how is it that they're reshaping the city of Tokyo to be this metropolis? And so that so I realized more and more that it's not just centralizing the railway network on Tokyo. It's not just building these modern districts like the Ginza Brick Town. It's not just building National Diet Building, these other monumental structures. It has a lot more to do with the entire built environment. And in fact, even more impactful, you could say, in how Tokyo looked at the time, more impactful than the railways was things like the street infrastructure.
Mm.
In fact, most the by far and away the largest expense of Tokyo urban improvement throughout the 1890s all the way up to the 1920s. It wasn't things like putting in sewers. It wasn't fresh water lines. It was repaving streets. So as I was reading more and more about the history of urban improvement in Japan, it became clear to me that street pavements and street improvements were of the utmost concern. What they spent the most on. It's what they focused on the most. And even as other projects like Ginza Bricktown were canceled, even as things like the Port of Tokyo were canceled, there was a consistent focus on we have to widen and straighten and repave streets.
Nowadays, we walk around the cities, everything's paved, and
Yeah.
everything's just this is how it is.
Uh-huh.
We don't necessarily question that, but how do we, if we look back and you've researched that, how do we
Mhm.
understand the impact this repavement of the street had on
Mhm.
the people living there at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the things that I find most fascinating about street pavements. And as my students know, in class, if they want to get me off topic, all they have to do is talk about trains or street pavements. Uh, you're absolutely right that now we think about streets, we think about asphalt, and we think about how smooth and everything they are. Um, One of the things that surprised me the most when I was doing the research on street pavements in Tokyo, I came across this map from 1930, uh, and it's a map, a map that today seems very strange. And what makes it strange is that it's a map not only of the streets, but also the different types of street pavements in the different parts of the city. In fact, there's no fewer than 13 different types of paving materials in different parts of the city. And so now we just, it's universally expected that asphalt. But uh, back then, you would have asphalt, you would have, well, of course, gravel, but then there's macadam, there's tar macadam, there's bricks, there's even wood blocks
Mhm.
that you would get that would be in the street. Then maybe you'd have wood blocks covered in some type of tar-like asphalt surface. Many different types of pavements that were chosen entirely based on what kind of a traffic are we expecting, whether it's pedestrian or is it foot traffic or bicycle traffic or vehicle traffic. How much are we expecting per day? Because certain materials are going to wear down more quickly, then you have to replace them. How expensive is the type of material? How difficult is it to replace? All these kind of things that go into the calculus of what material are we going to use where. And so you get a sense of, again, what are planners most focusing on? Is it we need the street for aesthetic purposes, we need it for recreational purposes, or is it totally for conveyance of goods? And there's a scholar of urban environmental history named Clay McShane who makes a great point about how the type of pavement surface that we see on streets changes over time as a result of how we even think about the streets change. If you go back to the 1880s, 1890s, especially in urban areas, um, streets are not solely a place for vehicles for obvious reasons. I mean, not many people have private cars in the
Mhm.
1880s. And this is especially true in Tokyo, where private vehicle usage is very limited all the way through the 1920s and 30s, even up until the 1950s is when you really start to see private vehicles becoming used more. Um, and so if the streets aren't being used solely for cars or solely for horse-drawn carriages and buggies, What are they being used for? It's in fact streets were sometimes where kids would play. I mean, obviously that still happens today, and the car comes by and you have to brake to let the car through. But uh, as streets become more focused on vehicular usage and trying to get from point A to point B faster and faster, they become less of a public space and more about, again, speed. So we want types of pavement materials that facilitate speed. We want types of pavement materials that don't produce a lot of puddles, for example, or potholes or things like this. And so the pavement surface changes as part of this matrix of factors, including how we think about the street, what we use the street for, and what we want the street to symbolize in terms of being the face of the city and the place where people first experience the city and what the city looks like.
All of this kind of originally happened. We were talking so far about the period late 1800s, late 1900s, late 1800s and
Yeah.
early 1900s.
Yeah.
Comes the war, Tokyo is reduced to ashes like many other cities in Japan. All of this development is kind of gone, destroyed. Do they then pick up the old plans and like, okay, let's just redo the same and update with new materials? Or was it like, oh, wait a second, it's been 50 years, society has changed, the number of people has changed, we need to think about other things, because the cars today are different than the cars they used back then, or the vehicles they used back then?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, Tokyo was absolutely destroyed in 1945 because of the fire bombings, and but I mean, one of the unique things about Tokyo history is that Tokyo is repeatedly destroyed. 1945 and 1923 Kanto earthquake. Even before Tokyo becomes Tokyo, you could go all the way back to 1657, the Meiji fire, when over 90% of Edo is destroyed. So one of the things that when people think about urban planning of Tokyo, and this comes up a lot, and a lot of tourists will say like, oh, there is actually planning in a place like Tokyo. It doesn't feel planned in that. And I think what people mean by that is it doesn't have a lot of grids, right? From a kind of
Compared to Osaka downtown is very grid-like city.
Or Sapporo, Sendai, even in the pre-war period. I mean, there were grids in Tokyo. Ginza, for example, a lot of what are called uh, a lot of the commoner parts of Tokyo had grids, uh, but it doesn't feel like New York, where you have this like very rigid grid. And I think that's often what people mean when they say Tokyo doesn't have planning. From the 1890s, in fact, 1890 is the first citywide urban plan that gets adopted for Tokyo. But what Japan doesn't have is an eminent domain law. It's on the books, but nobody uses it. The governors don't have the power to use it in the 1890s. And so you don't get this case where in other cities, like the famous example is Paris in the 1850s, when Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann come in and literally bulldoze through neighborhoods in order to put in the boulevards. You don't have that in Tokyo. Instead, what you have is this comprehensive citywide plan that can only be effectuated in cases of fire. And Edo was very famous for having these repeated fires, not only because of earthquakes, but because of the wooden construction. Same is true in Tokyo. There's dozens of fires every year, all the way, even before the 23 catastrophe and the 45 firebombing. So every time there's a fire, the city planners basically go out, look at the area that is destroyed by fire, spread out the comprehensive urban design plan, and say like, okay, well, now we can go in and fix this area. And so what you get is a kind of like these kind of islands of planned, developed areas where they've widened the streets, they've put in gutters and underground pipelines and everything. Islands of development within a sea of kind of unplanned sprawl. And this is true all the way up. Well, we can talk even after the war. And so in 23, after the Great Kanto earthquake, there is a plan. It's called the Teito Fukko Jigyo, or the Imperial Capital Restoration Plan, um, championed by Goto Shinpei, that sets out a plan in order to create widened streets. So many of the Meiji Dori, for example, or many of these kind of ring roads around the outskirts of the central business district come from this 1923 plan. But again, they can't. I mean, this is an opportune moment to go in and literally with a blank canvas where things have been destroyed, we can start putting into effect some of these plans that we've had. But then in 45, when the reconstruction comes in, same thing. We want to put in things from the 23 plan that get adopted at that point.
You mentioned kind of islands of planning. It's like, okay, well, this area was just destroyed. Now let's think about how we can improve that.
Yeah.
Earlier in our conversation, you said, the Tokyo, Yokohama area, some estimates account 40 million people. At that time, I cannot imagine that they ever imagined there would be, or ever considered that there would be that many people living in this area. You cannot plan for this, can you?
Yeah. And so the big question is, where do we draw what are called the kukaku? So basically the lines of the city. And so the urban improvement planning really starts at starts in the 1880s with delineating what are the urban districts, and delineating which areas we should focus on. And so the governor at the time, Governor Matsuda, was saying we have to delineate the central business district and then focus on improving that. So we're going to widen the streets, we're going to pave the streets. We're also going to clear out all the slums so that we can eliminate the problem of what he called hinpizakyo, which was the mixture of the rich and the poor was one of the problems facing Tokyo at the time, according to him. So we're going to eliminate the slums to keep all the business and the wealthy people in this part of town and clear out everything else. But it starts with this process of delineating which part is the city. And this is a problem that goes through after the earthquake, as well as when Tokyo really starts growing. The earthquake of 23. So we talked about the private railways like Seibu and Tobu and Tokyo. After the earthquake, the families that run these companies, the Tsutsumi family in the case of Seibu, or the Nezu family in the case of Tobu, go in and buy up all this land that they can. And so, for example, the town of Ikebukuro is Seibu and Tobu now. The Tsutsumi Yoshiaki, I think, was the founder. Goes in, buys up all the land around Ikebukuro Station, and says, this is going to be this new hub, and we're going to start developing this. Also buys the Kawagoe Tetsudo, which was already there, and creates what now is the Seibu network, and really drives the expansion out into the suburban areas. And it's almost entirely left to Seibu's purposes to do whatever they want. And you get this kind of horizontal monopoly that grows where, and I'm probably familiar with this from Osaka as well, where you can spend your whole life, or your whole life is basically controlled by the private railway company.
Mhm.
And Seibu is a perfect example, because let's say you live along the Seibu line, you're probably living on land that at one point was sold to you by the Seibu Railway Company, or the Seibu Real Estate Company, in a house that was built by the Seibu Construction Company, powered with electricity from the Seibu Electric Company that they use to run their electric trains, and they can sell the surplus for houses. Maybe when you woke up in the morning on the way to the station, you stopped at the Family Mart, which is owned by Seibu. Or maybe you ate lunch at Yoshinoya, which is owned by Seibu. Or you went to the Seibu department store. And then when you got off of work, you came home and turned on the TV and watched the Seibu Lions. And then on the weekend, for fun, you get on the train, go the opposite direction, and go to Toshimaen, which is the Seibu amusement park. And you can spend your whole life on the Seibu line, where all aspects of life are controlled by this one company. But when you get that, the city isn't actually planning these things. So they've also kind of ceded planning control of these, and the development of this real estate to these private companies, especially in the suburban areas, where a lot of the planning for things like streets have to be this wide, or you have to bury bury your electric lines or you have to
Hmm.
bury your sewer lines. That's limited to certain areas of the city. And the private developers don't really have to follow those things. And so when you go out into the suburban areas, you don't see sidewalks necessarily. You don't see buried electric lines. You don't really even see parks. And so the most of the suburban redevelopment we see now, it's called kukakusei, which is the government will try to go in and has to get the agreement of all landowners to go into this redevelopment project.
Sounds like a near impossible task.
It can be, and so, what you see in suburban areas is these kind of, again, pockets of planning as a result of these Kukakusei projects, and the way that you try to entice landowners is say, "Well, if we wanna widen the street or maybe straighten it out, we're gonna take a little piece of everybody's property, but in exchange, we're going to put in better infrastructure, and then maybe at the center of this neighborhood, we'll put in a little park." And so while you're losing property, your property value will go up because now there's a park,
Hmm.
and so you try to entice people like that. But even if one landowner holds out, then the project can't go forward. And again, Japan doesn't have an eminent domain law that is put into effect. So one
Yeah.
person really can disrupt the
Stopped the
project. Yeah.
complete development. So I think you said 2002 is when you came as an
Mhm.
exchange student to
Yeah.
Waseda, and you were standing on the train looking at the map, and
Yeah.
that kind of triggered this
Yeah.
interest.
Uh-huh.
And then you went down this rabbit hole, which I think when you become a scholar,
Yeah.
you just end up going down further and further the rabbit hole, and made it your career.
Uh-huh.
Why is it so important today to still study these historical maps, these historical laws, for you and for us listeners,
Mhm.
or to kind of understand Tokyo and Japan?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this gets to the question of why is history even important? Um, why is it that we have to keep studying things that happened 150, 200, in Japan's case, as early as 16,000 years ago? Uh, and I always think about this as history tells us not only how we got to where we are, but I would say history can also inform why we think the way we think, why we as people are the way that we are, why we believe the things that we believe. Um, I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about, again, street pavements and cities, and we don't, as people, we aren't necessarily cognizant of how our surroundings shape us as individuals, or even the fact that why asphalt is the most prevalent type of material. We take things for granted, and so I've always been interested in trying to understand why we take certain things for granted. And so, I've always been curious about, well, why is it that we use asphalt today? Why is it that in the past they use wood blocks pavement? Why is it that this thing happened this way? And history really is an attempt to understand why things happen that way. Um, but when you think about why do we study it and continue to study it, it's not just we want to learn why things happen the way they did in the past, but recognizing that even the things we learn today, and that goes for not only historical education, but really any kind of education, is you know why is it that we believe the things we do, and that often is because of things that happened in the past. And so when I'm in class, what I always encourage my students to think about is, if you hear something new, you know, maybe you're surprised, maybe you're like, oh, that doesn't sound right, maybe you're angry, maybe you're glad, but to really be self-critical and think about, well, why is it that I'm reacting this way? Why didn't I know that before? Why should I know that? Why did I react this way? And so it is a kind of self-reflective exercise. Um, and I think that's something that you can get from studying history that perhaps you don't necessarily get in studying other fields.
History is very long.
Hmm.
There are many areas people can study, and in a way, one led to the other, led to the other, led to today.
Hmm.
And so it's very difficult to kind of get the full grasp of why is the pavement the way it is.
Hmm.
For you as a scholar, you've decided to specialize in one specific area. I think the Meiji period.
Mhm.
You also mentioned earlier, I think 1972 was the first railway in
1872.
1872. Sorry, first railway in Japan, which is kind of
Mhm.
that period.
Yeah.
So what is it specifically that for people like me or living here in Japan and walking around the city, we can learn from that period that is influencing the way we live today?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways we could address this question, and different directions we could go with it. On the one hand, you walk around a city today like Osaka, or Tokyo for that matter, and the cities look, modern. And then, but you think about, well, what does that actually mean? Buildings look Western, and I mean, this steel and glass, highways in the sky, concrete infrastructure, all this stuff. Uh, but I think what we have to question is, why do we associate modern with Western? And this is one of the biggest topics, I think, most pressing topics in Japan, especially in the Meiji period. It is this time when Japan is self-consciously remodeling itself off of Western nations as a way to catch up to and eventually, hopefully, surpass the Western nations, and really trying to prove to the West that we're just as strong and modern as you are. So please don't colonize us. Um, and so you do have this very concerted attempt to remodel Japan on Western forms, not only in politics and the economy and society and culture, but also even in built forms. So that includes things like buildings and street pavements. And so this, the reason Osaka looks the way it does today, I would say, is because of this attempt in the Meiji period in order to transform Japan into a more Western style country superficially. Uh, but as you mentioned before, the fire bombings certainly have
Mhm.
a major impact on that.
So if we walk around the city nowadays, for example, are there things we can notice and we can look at and be like, oh, this is from the Meiji period. This is here because back then someone made this and that decision.
Hmm. I mean, I can speak more to that in the case of Tokyo than Osaka,
Hmm.
for example, because most of my work has been on Tokyo. And uh, in Tokyo recently, yes, you can. In fact, there's been more of an attempt to not necessarily preserve, but reconstruct some of the Meiji era buildings. So the former for the former Shimbashi station, which is now called Shiodome Station, even Tokyo Station, which uh, built in 1914, arguably is Taisho era building, but really the kind of capstone of Meiji architecture, even though the Meiji period ends in 1912. Um, Tokyo Bankers Club, the Mitsubishi Ichigo-kan that was built by Josiah Condor in the 1890s. But these are all reconstructions that have been built in order to restore some of the pre-war or Meiji era buildings. In Japan's case, there wasn't, because of the repeated destruction of Tokyo that we talked about before with the Edo fires and the 23 earthquake, and there wasn't a lot of permanence to the city, and so that translated into not much concern for preservation of old buildings. It was more that these old buildings are small and got in the way. And in fact, in the 1980s, there was even a, a plan by JR to tear down Tokyo Station.
Really, that
Yeah.
beautiful building, they wanted to get rid of it.
Well, in the 80s, it wasn't so beautiful. Right? It got bombed at the end of the war. The third story got destroyed. At the end of the war, Japan was a very incredibly poor country and didn't have money to rebuild Tokyo Station. So they basically just put these really simple square roofs on top, which is what Tokyo looked like up until 2014, uh, or 2012 when it was reopened. And so there were plans to tear it down in the 80s, and there was actually a citizens movement to preserve Tokyo Station, which was picking up steam. And but it wasn't until the very controversial governor Ishihara Shintaro picked it up and started championing it as a way to restore some greatness to Tokyo. And this was especially in the run up through the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. I was thinking if the world is going to be coming to Tokyo, then we have to create a gateway. And so I wrote about this in my dissertation because this is the same language you get about Tokyo Station in 1914. It's called the Teito no Genkan, the gateway to the imperial capital. And all great imperial capitals need to have some kind of symbolic, monumental edifice.
Mm.
And so they said, well, Tokyo Station, this is going to be our centerpiece. Very similar rhetoric between 1914 and the height of the Japanese Empire. The opening ceremony of Tokyo Station is actually, the very first train in Tokyo Station in December of 1914 is a train carrying the so-called the Gaisen Shogun, the triumphant generals of the occupation of Qingdao at the beginning of World War One. The very first train into Tokyo Station, they go from there to report to the emperor about their successful invasion of Qingdao. And so William Coldrake, this architectural historian of Japan, writes, this is kind of a double celebration, not only of the train station, but also of the expanding empire.
Mm.
And so there is this kind of connection between the urban space of Tokyo, the expanding empire, and the reputation of the city as a whole, and needing this kind of monumental space.
You did the first part of your career still in the United States at the university there, and now you mentioned 2022 you came to Nagoya.
Mhm.
So you kind of boots on the ground, so to say, you can observe. Why Nagoya specifically? You're in between the two big cities, but it's like the third one that everyone goes through, nobody stops at, if I may say so.
It is true. Nagoya has a reputation of being very boring. I'm here to say Nagoya is not boring. Um, I came to Nagoya University because they had a job available, and it's just kind of the truth of academia as you go where the jobs are. But I before landing in Nagoya in 2022, I'd been to Nagoya once before, maybe a decade earlier. Uh, didn't really spend much time. Ended up going down to Ise Shrine immediately, so didn't really experience Nagoya. Again, just kind of came in just like I did with Tokyo. Came in without really doing much research because I wanted to experience it fresh for the first time. I've really come to like Nagoya as a historian. As I try to convince everybody, Nagoya is an incredibly interesting place because it's tied to so many different historical developments. I mean, obviously, the three great unifiers all were based in Nagoya at one point. Even the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was born in Atsuta Shrine. There's a direct tie to Japanese state formation where we have Jinmu's sword is in Atsuta Shrine. Nagoya Castle gets burnt during the war, so it ties to that. Um, Even the post-war economic redevelopment, Toyota is right outside of Nagoya. So Nagoya has a lot going for it that I think deserves more attention. And so maybe we're not much, so we don't have to be as much of a Tsuka Toshi, the pass-through town.
So if we now connect this to your field of expertise, Nagoya is also the connecting city to Tokyo for this new hyperspeed
Yes,
train
that's
that
right.
is supposed to be built here, maglev,
Mhm.
I believe it's called.
Yes.
It's a work in project. You, as an historian, having studied railway networks in Japan, how do you look at this development plan, and what do you think it will have of an impact on a city like Nagoya?
I think it'll be great. 45 minutes from Nagoya to Tokyo on the
Hard to
line.
imagine, right?
Yeah,
45 minutes
yeah,
from Nagoya to Tokyo.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, if they get it done, I think it'll be great, and it'll hopefully bring more people to Nagoya and encourage people to travel around the country a bit more. Um, I think it's as a train enthusiast myself, it's also a great way to keep technology going forward. One thing I've noticed, one of the questions you had on there was, how is Nagoya different from other cities?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it definitely, you know, Nagoya has, or maybe one statistic that highlights what makes Nagoya different in terms of urban space. So, um, of the three largest, or of the three widest roads in Tokyo, sorry, of the three widest roads in Japan, one of them is in Sapporo. The other two are in Nagoya. I mean, this just highlights that how much Nagoya is a car-based city, and obviously, it's easy to say, well, of course, because Toyota's there. Um, but even looking at, Nagoya only has 2 JR lines. There's the Meitetsu private line. Kintetsu line only goes in, to Nagoya Station, doesn't really have much of a urban network. The Meitetsu line only has goes one line goes into the center of town, and then a couple more kind of branch off in suburban areas. Even the subway network is only 3 or 4 lines. So compared to Tokyo, there's, much more limited rail infrastructure. The bus infrastructure is very good, but for the most part, everybody has to drive around. So it's a much more car focused town, which means roads are wider, which impacts even how urban space is used. In Osaka and Tokyo, you don't need a lot of parking lots, for example, because not many people are driving. Whereas in Nagoya, even in downtown areas, there's much more coin parking.
Mm.
The Eon malls all have big parking lots, which means even in terms of residential spatial usage, everybody has carports, or they've taken out their gardens to put in driveways, for example. And so it's a reminder too of how when cities start being built around cars, it impacts all parts of the city. It's not just the roads; it's also just the usage of space.
Well, we sometimes see these. I don't know. You may have come across this. Is this imagery of um, a city street filled with cars,
Hmm.
and then the people sitting in
Hmm.
those cars, and then the cars are
The car
removed,
disappears.
and
Yeah,
we just see how
yeah,
much space
absolutely.
of the cities is used
Yeah.
for the cars that could be used for people walking around, cycling around.
Yeah, and I've noticed walking around Nagoya, you see these. They'll tear down a house, and then the coin parking goes in it, and
Mm.
the coin parking you can fit like 6 or 7 cars or whatever. But it's like, wow, that's could have been a house for somebody to live in.
Moving to Japan and kind of being here every day, as a historian, having studied all this infrastructure, do you look at the country now differently? Do you observe things and kind of just wonder and realize things that you maybe didn't so much when you were still abroad and studying mostly text, historical documents, maps,
Hmm.
accounts of the development of Japan?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, being in Nagoya and spending more time in the Kenai region over here, thing that really sticks out to me. I mean, I like riding trains around, and so I'm always looking out the window of the train and kind of looking out over the landscape. And I'd say there's been two things that have really stuck out to me. One, uh, I have a strong interest in Japanese pre-modern history as well, and so especially what you could consider prehistoric history.
Hmm.
So particularly in what's called the Kofun Jidai, or the tumulus period, from about 250 CE up until the origins of the Japanese centralized state in the mid 6th century. And so this was a time when the ancient chieftains and kings would build mounded burial sites as their tombs.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of controversy about this that we don't need to go into necessarily, but you can spot them when you're going through the
They
countryside.
look keyhole shaped a little bit
Yeah,
sometimes. Yeah.
the keyhole shaped mounded tombs,
Yeah.
and of course the big one here is Nintoku's tomb in Sakai.
Mm-hmm.
But there's tens of thousands of these around Japan. Uh, During the Meiji period, the Kunaicho, or the Imperial Household Ministry, went around and designated certain major ones as the burial sites of emperors that uh, appeared in the Nihon Shoki or the Kojiki, for example. But there's tens of thousands of them all around, even in Nagoya, in like a place called Osu, which is kind of an alley, very similar to Osaka, like Dotonbori or Shinsaibashi, that kind of area. Right in the middle, there's a kofun
Oh,
that's now a park, um, or even in the middle of Meikolde, Nagoya Institute of Technology, right in the middle of their campus, there's another kofun.
wow.
Or next to Tsudama Park, there's a kofun there, and you can find these all over. And going around on the streets, or on the trains looking out the windows, off in the distance, you'll see a little clump of trees. Like, oh, that's an interesting park, a little hill, and then sure enough, it's a kofun. And so that's been one of the really interesting things about living in this part of Japan, where everywhere you walk around, there is something historical. Uh, my wife came to Japan here with me, and we'll be walking. And she's always fascinated by how we'll walk through a neighborhood and find a little shrine, and she'll ask me how old it is, and like, oh, it says this one was, built in the 1300s, and for Americans, a country that's only been around 250 years or so, it's just
Next year, right? 250.
that's right.
Yeah.
It just kind of blows your mind a little bit of how long some of these things have been here.
It is hard to fathom the kind of scale of
Yeah.
history that has been kind of developing just on this island without being so much mixed with the neighbors. Growing up in Europe, it's been back and forth all the time from all directions. So the development has been influenced by many different things, but here it's kind of a very secular development that has happened over time.
Yes and no. I mean, this is another big debate in Japanese history as well, and I mean, we don't have to get into origins of the Japanese language, or migrations in the Yamato, or the Jomon Yamato period, all that stuff, or the Jomon Yayoi split and all that. But in terms of architecture and urban planning, this comes up. Uh, there's a big question about, should we view 1868, this Meiji Restoration year, as a moment of rupture in Japanese history, or not really all that important? Is the Meiji period a story of rapid revolutionary transformation in all aspects of Japanese culture, politics, religion, economics, including urban forms? Or is it not really all that important? Is it more just a story of continuity and not much change at all? There's big debates in the field of how should we think about urban change and this transition from Edo to Tokyo. In the 1980s, there was scholars like Ogi Shinzo and Jinnai Hidenobu who were champions of this, or became really popular as part of what's called the Edo-gaku boom, or like the Edo studies boom.
Hmm.
And so Jinnai had this book called Tokyo: A Spatial Anthropology, where he goes through and identifies all of the different ways that you can still see Edo in the city of Tokyo, and points out things like you know, the uh, the layouts of different plots stay the same. The road network largely stays the same, and so in many ways, you can almost think of Tokyo as this palimpsest of hundreds of years, from about the mid 15th century, when Ota Dokan builds the first Edo castle. The Edo grows and becomes a city of Tokyo, and it's just layer after layer built on top of each other, and you can dig through, and you can imagine people kind of going through with their guidebooks, and they have guidebooks for this. You can go find this wall, for example, that
Oh,
dates back to the 1600s or things like that. And so there's a lot of historians will say, well, see, things haven't really changed that much. The Meiji period wasn't all that important. Yes, there were transformations, but let's not exaggerate things, and say that everything changed overnight. And, uh, I mean, for obvious reasons, right? Of course, nothing's going to change overnight. Um, but there are attempts by the Meiji government, and Ginza Bricktown, I would say, is the biggest example of really trying to distance themselves from the previous Tokugawa government. We're no longer this ancien regime. We're bringers of modernization. We're the bringers of Western civilization. And what better way for them to demonstrate that, by trying to transform Japan, or trying to transform Tokyo into this new Western style capital? And it becomes this Western style capital, this beacon of modernity for the rest of the Japanese islands, and sets the template that then gets carried around even to places like Seoul and Taipei, which was the
mm,
other parts of my dissertation.
that continue there.
Yeah.
What are you researching at the moment? What are you looking to?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Uh, when I was teaching at the University of British Columbia, was teaching a class on history and film. And so I got more into thinking about represent how or thinking about how can we see historical memory shift over time. And so I wanted to take one topic and one media and really demonstrate how historical narratives about that topic change over time in response to contemporary events. And so the topic that I seized on as the best way to illustrate that was uh, memory of World War II as represented in Japanese war films. And so looking at these films over time, how is the narrative of Japan's participation in World War II changing over time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up till today? And then what's impacting how those narratives are changing? Why is it that certain narratives are being brought in, certain events are being brought in, certain characters, things like this? And so you can really highlight over time how the attitude, how the memory of the war changes in reaction to contemporary developments. And that was kind of sparked by when I was in Vancouver. I was the historical advisor or historical consultant for The Man in the High Castle
Oh,
on
wow.
Amazon, on season 4. So that was kind of fun being on
Yeah, I
set
can imagine.
and seeing the filming and working with the crew in order to make the make the show as historically accurate as possible, which I always thought was kind of funny because I kept telling them like, "Well, none of this would have happened," but it's
But let's make it
let's
accurate.
make it
Just
accurate. And so they got tired of me saying like, "Oh, you want to make this accurate? Well, none of this would none of this would happen."
so you kind of shifted away a little bit from urban development and planning right
Yeah.
now, looking at film history. But it's kind of fascinating too, because you mentioned so it's a historical time. The facts are there in the past.
Mhm,
It's happened. We cannot redo history, but
mhm,
it seems like it can be rewritten from memory.
yeah,
Memories change over time. The narrative changes over time,
mhm.
and this affects people's perceptions of historical events today.
Yeah, this is another big debate within the field of history. Between what you could think of as postmodern history or more positivist history. Um, and it's something that we discuss a lot in my classes. Is there an objective historical truth or capital T truth of history that we can ever uncover? And like you said, things do happen in the past, but the question is, can we actually truly ever understand them today? And how would we even go about doing that? And so the positivist side of the debate would say, well, if we get enough historical documents, if we get enough evidence, we uncover enough, records and materials, then eventually we'll get to the objective historical truth.
Is there still much to uncover? Uh,
Sure, there's always more things that we can
I mean,
learn.
in terms of the documentation is there, you can read it again, maybe have a different read. Maybe someone will have a read of a document, having knowledge of something else, and be able to connect dots someone else couldn't.
Uh,
But are we still going to uncover more documents that have not been found
Well,
yet?
that's a very postmodern view.
Yeah.
I mean, you could always say, maybe somewhere, in an archive, there's a cache of documents that fell behind the shelf and has been covered in dust. And there are cases where, I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union was a great example, or the death of the Showa Emperor in '89, where finally new documents are released. And so
Oh,
there are cases where new documents do come out that lead to new interpretation or new facts that change how we think of things. On the other side, the postmodernists would say similar to you, like, it's about interpretation of what we already know. And so the postmodernists would say, well, no, we can't actually ever get to an objective truth because all of those things we're talking about, the archival documents, all those things, these are these are materials written by fallible human beings. And so they're not the truth, they're a version of the truth. And the way I illustrate this, in class, I'd say, there's 20 of us in this classroom. Let's all go home and write our version of what happened today in this classroom. And then, 100 years from now, if a historian finds all 20 of these records, would they actually be able to second by second accurately reproduce what happened? Might get kind of close, but
It's 20 interpretation of what
Right.
happened in a classroom.
And it's not only subject to to that historian's interpretation, it's that that narrative of what happened in the classroom is now also subject to not only their interpretation of the documents they're reading, it's also subject to the interpretation of the people who wrote those documents in the first place. And so a document isn't necessarily an objective representation of truth. It's you could say it's a version of what I as a person think is the truth, and that's what I'm writing down in this document. Maps are actually a perfect example of this. You know, we so often we think of maps as just a visual representation of geospatial data. But then if you start thinking about, well, you know, on a map you have geographic north and you have magnetic north, which are not the same thing. Right? Or I mean, how oftentimes have you opened up Google Maps and you know it says your GPS location is like
Mm-hmm.
way off of where you actually are? Uh, you can even have maps like think about a map to what's let's say Osaka Universal Studios. You know, that's a map when they give
Yeah.
you. Is that an accurate map? You know, maybe not spatially accurate, but you know, it conveys knowledge in a way that you as a user or as a
Can go from A
visitor,
to B.
right?
Mm.
I mean, but could you like really tell like down to an inch what is the distance between this ride and that ride based on that map? Well, no, but that's also not what that map is for. Maps are visual representations of space that are meant to convey certain data for different purposes. You can also have maps, say, for example, of in my own research, when in colonial Seoul, Japan, the Japanese colonial government is saying these are the street improvements that we want to achieve. And so we're going to put out this map laying out this is what the city is going to look like after these street improvements. We could look at that map and say, oh, well, they must have achieved those things because it's in a map. They actually didn't achieve those things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a plan. So it's a map can also be a representation of what we want the world to look like rather than what the world actually is. And so these are the kinds of documents themselves are also in some cases representations of what we want the world to look like rather than the world it really is. And so historians have to be aware of all of these things and be critical of our sources as we're writing our narratives.
We talked a lot about your research and some of the things you've uncovered in your studies and papers you've written. And just now we had a conversation a little bit about more like concepts of historical interpretation and so on. As an associate professor now, you're also teaching. You brought up your classes as well. I'm curious about how these conversations are conducted here in Japanese universities.
Mhm.
How Japanese history students are kind of looking at their own country's history. I'm assuming that because you're teaching Japanese history, they're all interested in that. Yeah, how do these? Are there debates about these, or is this more like I don't know, like a Western concept to
Mhm.
the postmodernist, modernist interpretation of
Yeah.
history? Is this something that is equally taught and discussed here?
Well, I should say first that so I teach at Nagoya University in a program that's taught entirely in English. And so this is a degree awarding program that is taught entirely in English. And in fact, most of our students are non Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
coming from other countries around Asia. In fact, it's by far the most diverse program I've ever taught in, uh, which is really rewarding. But it does present, I'd say the biggest challenges of that are a lot of my jokes based on American sitcoms don't work in class anymore. Um, but the question about how is history in Japan taught differently? It is very different. Um, in Japanese, I mean, I shouldn't speak too confidently about the Japanese education system because I didn't go through it. But based on what I've understood, there's a lot more focus on the kind of what you can think of as the basic facts of history. So you're going to memorize this.
So 1872, I'm gonna get it right. First train
Right.
line set up here in
Right.
Japan, and you memorize that.
Right. You remember dates, places, and names. You know, the basic, you could say, nuts and bolts facts of history. And the famous example is I Kunitsukuro Kamakura Bakufu. Right? In 1192, Minamoto no Yoritomo founds the Kamakura Bakufu. This is the first shogunate in Japan. E-kuni is 1192, right? So that's how it's a kind of mnemonic device to
Ah,
remember
okay.
1192. Uh, what that doesn't tell you, though, is, well, why do we think of 1192 as the date of the founding of the Kamakura shogunate? Historians would, there's a debate: should we use the year 1192 or the year 1185? 1185 is the end of the Genpei Wars, when Minamoto Yoritomo defeats the Taira family and is able to finally control all of Japan. Uh, so after 1185, Kamakura is effectively the political center of Japan. The Minamoto family and the Hojo family, by extension, are pretty much in control of Japan. But why is it that 1192 becomes the year that we remember? 1192, it turns out, is the year that Yoritomo is named shogun by the emperor. Another example would be, say, when does the Tokugawa Bakufu start? Historians would argue about whether it's the year 1600 or the year 1603. 1600 is the Battle of Sekigahara, when Ieyasu defeats the Western army. After which, nobody is challenging Ieyasu for control of Japan. So effectively, after Sekigahara, Ieyasu is in control of Japan. Some historians, though, would still say that that Tokugawa period starts in 1603. Again, because that's the year that the emperor uh, designates Ieyasu as shogun. So even these things like, historical dates, uh, why are we focusing on certain dates? Well, if we want to highlight the emperor's role, then we'll focus on the actions that he did: 1192, 1603, these other important dates. Uh, and we'll assign importance to them because the emperor did them, even though in reality it had no real effect on the ground. And so in Japan, you often get cases where we're just focusing on those dates without the explanation why. And so a lot of students will say, well, history's boring. I'm sick of memorizing all of these things. Whereas, as a historian myself, like I was saying before, we want to be curious and question our received narratives. I mean, that's really what history is all about: is challenging received wisdom and challenging received narratives, constantly revising what we know about the past. It can be reading the same document over and over with different eyes, different mindsets, and revisiting old stories with new ideas in mind gives us a new interpretation of the past. And that's why history really never is past. We say historians act with one foot in the past, one foot in the present. But history is never really dead because we're constantly giving it new life.
So you will not run out of things to study.
Guess that means I'll never run out of a job, is it?
Still have plenty of maps to look at, railway networks to explore. Any recommendations as a historian and railway network expert?
Mhm.
Which ones to take to kind of get a
Oh.
good ride and enjoy something maybe with a different perspective than just being stuck on the Yamanote line in a crowded train?
Japan has some excellent tourist trains. I'll say that the Tokyu trains are very nice. That's been one that I enjoyed riding on. Uh, yeah, that's a really interesting question. Again, I like I'm always looking out the windows and um, curious about why lines are going where they're going. Um, One thing that surprised me, if you've taken, say, the Keisei line from Ueno out to Narita, um, at one point when you're going on what's called the Hokusosen, the North Chiba line, uh, the right of way expands from just a very typical narrow right of way to an incredibly wide, and you can even see there's, like, it looks like you're in a culvert basically. I was always curious, well, why in that one stretch on the way out to Narita Airport is there this huge culvert? Turns out they were actually going to build a Shinkansen out there, but it was never went to culmination. But the line is still there. Another thing that thought was really interesting about the Tokyo train network, um, when you think of the station names are usually historical names rather than actual geographic names. Another one, the train names or the train line names themselves are often harking back to older geographic names, like Seibu, for example, or Tobu. That's a reference to the Musashi Prefecture, which is what the Kanto area used to be called. And so Tobu is literally the east side of Musashi, whereas Seibu is the west side of Musashi. So, yeah, or even the Tokyo or the Toyoko-sen connects Tokyo and Yokohama. That one's a little more obvious, but the Hokuso line, for example, is because Chiba used to be called the anyway, it's the old place name for Chiba.
Why does Tokyo have 2 subway companies? This is one thing that really surprised me when I first got there, because that you have multiple companies building tracks above ground going in different directions, I can understand. Underground is a much bigger challenge to build and seems so inconvenient to have 2 companies digging tunnels under the city.
Well, one is used to be Toei, right? So that was actually municipally operated by the municipal government, whereas the other one was a private company. So Tokyo Metro was private, and then you had the Toei Oedo and then Toei Mitasen. Now I think they've all conglomerated into Tokyo Metro, but it used to be somewhere operated by the city itself.
Finally, I get my answer to that question. Tristan, thank you so much for coming and sharing so many insights. I'm sure we could have gone many other directions and side stories about trains and urban development and asphalt in Japan. I mean, it's a country with very big urban spaces. Is there any topic that we didn't really get into today that you would have liked to talk about, that you're particularly interested in and would like to share? Or did we kind of cover, get a general idea for what is out there and a good reason to kind of look out the window from the train instead of on the phone and enjoy Japan's tracks?
I'd say I encourage everyone to ride the rails and go by train. You can always experience new places and meet new people, see new sights, places you wouldn't expect to go. And Japan's one of the best places for that. So you can go on a new adventure on the train.
Thank you very much for coming from Nagoya to talk to us.
On the train.
On the train. And if people are interested, we'll put a link to your research in the description so they can kind of read a little bit of your papers and maybe spend more time with what we've condensed here into a little bit over an hour of conversations about Japan's urban development, which is very short for the amount of history that we kind of tried to discuss, and it gives very little room for digging deeper. But thank you so much for sharing. It was super interesting for me. Kind of, I got some of my questions answered and a better understanding of why things are the way they are, and a good reason to study a bit more history by myself.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening and watching. This was Unpacking Japan, and we'll be back again in the next episode. Bye. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future conversations. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this episode, here are a couple more that we think you'll enjoy. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you next time.